This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and ideas and other stuff. Our guest today is a lecturer in American history at the University of Haifa. He's also the author of a new book entitled The Pricing of Progress, Economic Indicators and the Capitalization of American Life. It was recently published by Harvard University Press. Dr. Eli Cook, hello and welcome. Welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Great to be back.
So, your book focuses on a specific moment in the economic history of the world in which metrics were introduced to measure economic objects that had hitherto been impossible to quantify, such as labor, production, standard of living, etc. Is this a fair way to describe what you refer to as capitalization? And also, what period and where exactly are we talking about?
Right. So, markets and money have been around for millennia. But what I argue in the book is that really only in the mid-19th century do we begin to see people valuing progress in units of money. So it becomes actually something that's more than just economic objects. People begin to use money or money units or price statistics to measure human beings, to measure if their society is more advanced than others. It's kind of like this moment where money leaves the sphere of just the commodities and begins to become a measure of all things. And as far as the time frame goes, so my book actually covers almost 300 years. It starts in the mid-17th century in England, and it goes into kind of basically the invention of GDP. That's kind of the end of the story in the 1930s. But the bulk of the argument is kind of the 19th century. So I basically have a few early chapters, but that's more to just show just how radical this notion of pricing of progress is. So I have this guy, William Petty, and Alexander Hamilton, who's now famous because of the Broadway play.
He was famous before.
And they're all, like really excited about pricing everyday life, and they fail miserably, basically, because everyone's like, what are you doing? You're crazy. But then in the 19th century, I really show how it slowly becomes more and more acceptable, and by the turn of the 20th century, almost hegemonic. And it's in that it's.
I want to try to get back to characterizing the core sort of statement that you're making.
Yeah.
It seems to me like you're saying the Western world moved to a sort of social assessment system whereby progress, human well-being is measured mathematically and then statistically and primarily economically, as you point out. And that I think what you're saying is that this system contains certain flaws that maybe don't capture fully human well-being. Is that what you're getting across?
You can't read my book two ways. I believe in writing a history that's empirical, that's accurate, but absolutely I wear my politics on my sleeve in this book, and I think it's very clear that there are moments in this book where I point out the dangers that occur when we begin to kind of price everyday life. So absolutely. And one of the arcs that I actually show in the book, and it's very important to me, is you mentioned statistics. So the rise of statistics kind of occurs in the early 19th century, but then it's what's called moral statistics. And those moral statistics are oftentimes, measuring really important things like poverty or even prostitution or incarceration rates and things that are really kind of the unit of measure there is like human well-being. And I don't romanticize these moral statistics. They were often used in very kind of disciplinary ways by elites, but still, it's important for me to point out that they were measuring kind of like our lives, our progress through the conditions of the human beings. And what I try to show in the second half is that really we kind of have a reversal of means and ends. So the kind of the goal of these measures, the goal of progress becomes not, bettering the human condition, but rather, maximizing market productivity.
I think we have to give a nice quote from your book that exemplifies this, where you say, rather than measure the extent to which economic relations were satisfying the needs of Americans, economic indicators examined whether humanity was satisfying the needs of pecuniary growth. Does that sort of capture what you're talking about?
That's exactly it. And this idea of reversal ends in me is not new. I mean, Aristotle talks about ideas of making money being wrong because, we should be focusing, So it is important to me to point out that sometimes economic growth, not sometimes, often economic growth does lead to a betterment of the human condition. But that becomes almost a secondary issue with these GDP metrics. The real goal in this pricing of progress is always kind of measured in money, always maximizing productivity, maximizing kind of per capita.
But isn't that really the purpose of economic policy, which these metrics serve for? I mean, the purpose of economic policy, as I see it, is really, as you say, to better the living conditions of people. I think that you're killing the messenger here in a way.
No.
The problem is really not the metrics themselves, but really what stands behind them, and that is the intentions of the policymakers.
No, so I actually think, so while I do think that economic growth often does use to human betterment, I still want to be very clear. The goal of GDP figures, and this is the big argument in the book to get back to the idea of capitalization, is basically my argument is that the reason we've turned to these economic statistics is because policymakers, elites, everyday people have begun to imagine the world as an economic investment, or more specifically, a capital investment. And in that sense, how do we measure the value of a capital investment? Well, we don't look at anything that's not, measured in money. All we look at is monetary output. Income, we think of the world and its people and its society and land and environment and labor as income-generating assets. And so in that sense, that's really where it comes from. So I don't think other people have written books about this stuff, and they often kind of say what you're saying is like, oh, well, this was an accident, mistakes were made. So, guys like economists that I really like Joseph Stiglitz writes a book, The Mismeasurement of Our Lives. So he's assuming, him and Amartya Sen and others, that this was a mistake. GDP was a good metric, but we took it too far. And my argument's very different. My argument, no, this is capitalism. This is what capitalism does.
That's what it was supposed to be. You have a point where you say it didn't have to be like this. Yeah. You said it now, and you also write alternative forms of measuring progress were pushed to the side.
Yeah.
What are those alternative forms of measuring progress? What would you suggest?
Right. So what I try to do in the book, so I'm an historian. So my goal is to create what's called a usable past. My goal isn't to kind of be a policymaker and sit there and say, this is what we should be counting. Rather, I'm going to say, listen, people have been debating this stuff, thinking about this stuff for a really long time. Let's see what they counted. So, a classic example I'm going to give is incarceration rates, which I mentioned before. Imagine if we measured American success and failure today according to incarceration rates.
Well, some of us do.
Some people do, yeah.
Right. Well, then America would be
some of them are sitting here in the studio.
Well, America would be the most failed state in the world because America has the highest incarceration rates in the world. And most people don't think of America, well, maybe now with Trump they do, but most people don't think of America as, a failed state. So that's just one example. But, there are numerous examples I try to give. Leisure time. The people thought that was a very important metric. Of course, things like gender discrimination, racism, inequality, poverty, social mobility, environmental sustainability, all of these things are very hard to measure if you only look at things in dollars and cents. It's just almost impossible. They become invisible, essentially.
I'd like to push you a bit more on my question of whether you're barking up the wrong tree or not. Is it really inextricably linked to capitalism? If you look at, economists or even Karl Marx, didn't they have metrics and all sorts of fancy ways to measure the economy to further their own ideological ends?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about this also in the book. For Marxists, for socialists, what's the measure of value? It's labor time. It's the amount of time and energy you're using to work. It's not money. In fact, Marx would say that GDP is what's called commodity fetishism. He says instead of looking at the important things in life, how much we work, how much we labor, energy, the feelings of fulfillment and things like that, we're letting the market kind of mask and obscure those things, and we're only looking at measurements in money. So for him, and I don't go as far as Marx in the book, but for him, the very act of exploitation is possible because people begin to look only at how much, they earn rather than how much they actually produced and things like that. So I would push back and still say that I do think that this is a uniquely capitalist invention. I think it's not a coincidence that for millennia we don't see anything like this. And by the way, if you were to look at communist Russia, they absolutely have their own, high modernism, aggregated statistics, but they're not measuring in money.
I think that it's clear that there's a sort of strong Marxist influence in your thinking about how to expose the economization of human value. But I also think that the really greater presence in your book that I see is Foucault. And I'd be really curious to hear how you see, what's your debt to Foucault here? Right. I mean, you're talking about moral statistics as a means of discipline and surveillance of society. How do you see the influence of his thinking on your work?
Yeah, so definitely Foucault has influenced me. And what I actually try to do with Foucault here is I actually think Foucault did a wonderful job with statistics, but he didn't do a very good job with economic statistics, which is actually surprising because Foucault's usually very good at this kind of thing. So when he talks about this idea of governmentality, what he's really talking about are these moral statistics. And, and I think he does a wonderful job there thinking about, this idea of the panopticon and how we begin to internalize this notion that we're constantly being surveyed through these statistics. But basically what I'm trying to do, my big kind of switch in this book is that moral statistics have gotten a bad rap, I basically argue. It's like, yes, there's a downside to all of this. But at the end of the day, they're measuring bodies and minds and not dollars and cents. And so what I do in the book is I say, economic statistics is a form of governmentality, but it's new. And I actually invent a word called investmentality, where I'm trying to say is that, this is actually the next level of governmentality. So it's also about surveillance. It's also about constantly watching people and seeing how productive they are. But now it's imagining the world strictly as an investment. And therefore, the measures are monetary measures. So, but yes, Foucault
let's take a step back for a second and tell us really what were the social and political conditions that brought about this, as you said, radical change in people's perception of economics and progress.
And just to add to his question, I just love the way it all starts by we can always blame everything on Oliver Cromwell. So I think you can tell us that story.
Or the English in general, yeah.
It definitely starts in England. I'm a firm believer that if you want to trace in general the roots of capitalism, you need to go back to England in the 17th century. I definitely believe that. And it starts with William Petty and Oliver Cromwell. And basically the kind of the first moment, and we talk again, the term capitalization, it's this notion that this pricing of progress emerges when we begin to see capital investment, when we begin to see, this idea that I'm going to treat land and labor and people and society and the future and time as this income-generating asset. World history is in England in the 17th century with the enclosure movement, where we really begin to see land, which used to be this kind of feudal, very hard to quantify its value, rooted in all of these traditional and hierarchical and social relations, and suddenly what we see is almost like a physical moment where people are kind of torn off, literally kind of torn off the land, and the land becomes an income-generating asset measured by how much rent it can kind of, amass in a year. And what I show is that very moment when they're doing that is also the very moment that this William Petty shows up, political arithmetic, and he begins to measure land, but not only land, labor, in these same kinds. He literally uses the same capitalization techniques to measure, the wealth of the nation, the wealth of the people. He prices, there's a plague in 1666. He prices it to see what, how much was lost. And so that's kind of like stage one. Stage two, which is also very important to my argument, is slavery. I can't emphasize enough how, and this is something that all historians of capitalism are coming back to now. We've basically, for a long time, and I think Marxists actually are to blame for this because they, for a very long time, said, slavery is not capitalism. And so now we're saying, no, slavery has a huge story here, especially in America, but also in England. And so basically what I show in kind of my second chapter is someone like Alexander Hamilton, who I mentioned before. Why is he suddenly pricing progress? And what I show is, Alexander Hamilton grew up on a Caribbean island, which was basically this entire island was an economic investment. 90% of the people on the island were enslaved. Almost everything produced on that island was for the market, which was very weird for the 18th century. And not only him, I show other kind of the governor of South Carolina and they're kind of like the progress pricing pioneers of the 18th century. And then in the 19th century, which is really the turning point. So in my book, the 1850s are kind of like the crucial decade. So before the 1850s, there's some pricing of progress, but it's not catching on. The moral statistics and the others, so they're really the dominant. And what I see in the 1850s, and I kind of see this through the kind of actually arguments between the North and South, which society is more advanced, I really see kind of like a flip. And you really see how these economic statistics are gaining the upper hand. And then I ask, what happened in the 1850s or in the 1840s and 1850s? And there it's very clear that it's things like railroad corporations and also just slavery kind of going up a notch, taking up a notch. So cotton slavery in the United States, very different from tobacco slavery. It's really only with cotton slavery that you really kind of get these planters imagining their slaves first and foremost as these income-generating investments. And they're measuring, how much they produce and how much money they make, and they're constantly buying and selling them. And there's this huge market, the domestic trade market, so they buy and sell them.
But doesn't it make perfect sense that when a market becomes developed enough, people will start speculating about the future rather than concentrate on what they have? It seems like a normal mental development in the way people think about the economy and about their own life.
I don't know normal, but I definitely think that if you live in a capitalist world where you're constantly kind of imagining land and labor and the basic elements of society as these income-generating units of gain, then it doesn't surprise me at all that elites kind of began thinking of everything in this. That's basically my argument. Yeah, once you begin to kind of go down that road, it's a slippery slope. And it's very easy to kind of not only talk about your business in that way, but all of a sudden you're talking about the government in that way and the nation and people. And so absolutely.
Another interesting argument in the book that you don't develop enough, or admittedly so, I mean, you're saying this is not about it, is the fact that it wasn't entirely a top-down process. What can you say about that?
Well, so I do think it was almost entirely a top-down process in the sense that this is a move that's coming from affluent white men specifically. But what I do try to say two things. First of all, there were certain aspects of the pricing of progress that working people in the end of the 19th century embraced. The biggest example I give in my book is the living wage, the idea of the living wage, that we can kind of, measure the welfare of people according to how much money they have to buy the basic elements of society. And I think those were immensely important. Until this day, I think ideas of living wage are very important. So that's one thing. And the other thing I try to show is that, not all price statistics are necessarily what I would call the pricing of progress. So you can subvert it. You can kind of create alternative metrics that are also measured in units of money, but that kind of challenge this notion of kind of growth and maximization. And of course, today we're living in a world with Thomas Piketty, which is, I think, the perfect example of that. Here is somebody who spends all his day looking at tax records. Basically, he's counting everything in money, but what he's really trying to do is not measure kind of like productivity or growth or things like that, but actually the exact opposite. He's actually trying to measure
I was thinking about the Gini index for that purpose.
It's the same thing. I mean, inequality is the same.
But what's so interesting is that in modern politics, I mean, really this book is nothing if not a political critique, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
in modern politics, I find, this is like going back to my roots and present as a campaign strategist, the concepts of GDP, growth, national deficit looms so large in the life of parties and candidates making their case to the voters. They talk about, I have managed to raise the GDP or raise growth or lower the deficit. And these are like sort of the central selling points, certainly in American political campaigning. And I just think it's amazing that I say me in terms of, because I'm a public opinion researcher, we know that for the most part, people don't feel those things. People don't feel GDP. People don't feel the budget deficit, and they barely even feel growth. How did we manage to convince whole electorates that GDP and deficits are the things that they should be voting on? What does that mean?
It was a hard sell, but they pulled it off. I write a lot about it in the book. I mean, the whole idea of the economy that we this idea of the economy that we measure in GDP is about that. But I have to say, I think we're reaching a turning point in this moment. So I think from the 1950s until I would even say Obama's election, I think you're right. I even give an example, not in the book, but in somewhere else. A Gallup poll in 2008 asked Americans, "What's the most important thing to you?" And so interesting. They didn't say my own well-being. They said the economy. They've internalized this idea that what really matters is this abstract thing that But I think inequality has begun to take its toll, and more Americans are realizing, and I can give you statistics on this, I think since the 70s, I think something like 75% of economic growth has gone to the top 10%. I hope I'm getting that right. So there is this moment.
That's in America, right?
That's in the United States. So there's this moment kind of where people begin to say, wait a minute. All of this growth, I mean, what is it even helping me if it's not even going into my pocket? So I do think and I even think the election of Donald Trump, and I mentioned Trump in the book, and I think Trump's a interesting character, but I do think that we're in this moment where people have actually lost faith in these metrics. So I kind of started writing this book in like the height of neoliberalism in 2009, 2010, and so we might already be reaching a point where no longer are people going to be convinced by a politician who says, oh, but I grew the economy by 4%.
But you can say that a robust economy is really a basic condition for the well-being of people. It's just that it doesn't always work the other way around, that their living conditions, a good standard of living, is a derivative of a robust economy. But it is a condition, isn't it?
Again, it's all about kind of where you stress. So when Americans do cost-benefit analyses, or when American politicians talk about what's the most important thing, it's not a condition for them. It's the goal. The goal is GDP. That's really and whereas I would say, okay, GDP can be one metric in our toolbox. By the way, turning GDP, of course, into a per capita average is completely meaningless in a world that is unequal. But okay, well, we can talk about that. But let's also talk about, how many people have healthcare, life expectancy, stress, like even, things. By the way, these are things that people measure. Insanity statistics were really big in the 19th century, and people often used them in like a kind of anti-capitalist way. They were saying all these asylums are being filled with these people because they were speculating on lots and they went mad when the market broke.
But it also sounds like part of the argument, the pro-slavery argument, that you have in your book where you write about people accusing the freed slaves of having high insanity statistics. Talk about how that played into it.
Right. So what I mentioned is like it's amazing to see the arguments over slavery. So in the 1830s, the 1840s, if you were in the North or in the South and you wanted to prove that your society was more advanced, you would turn to these moral statistics. And what happened in the 1840 census is that there was just a mistake in the census. And accidentally, the number of insane black people in the North got miscounted, and it's much higher than it actually was. And the Southerners just pounced on this. They were basically, okay, we're going to go take them to town on this. And like basically in every Southern speech almost in the 1840s, you hear them saying, oh, well, look what happens when you free black people. Look, they can't handle the freedom. They go mad. And by the way, they're not even using those statistics. They're very smart. They also look at the number of prisons you have in the North and how many black people are in the prisons. Now, of course, there's a reason we don't have prisons in the South. You don't need them because they're in open air prisons called plantations. But the South were very good at manipulating the moral statistics. But then in the 1850s, all that goes away almost. And what we begin to see is the debate both in the North and in the South where everyone's saying slavery is good because the per capita, productivity of Southerners is, $17 or per capita. Or in the North, they say, oh, well, we extracted $4 million worth of crops from the earth while you only extracted 3. And so the arguments shift. And basically, the bigger story here, if we kind of summarize the entire book, is that despite the cynicism that was being used in those earlier statistics, nevertheless, even the South was making an argument that said if you want to look at the measure of a society, you need to look at the condition of the African Americans. Whereas in the second examples, they don't care about the blacks at all. They don't even talk about them. All they talk about is slavery good for the economy or not? Is it growing the economy or not? Things like that.
No, I think another really striking realization is that in a way, Southern mentality has taken over the entire United States. As you said, it started there with the plantations and now...
Yeah, so I have a part later in the book, in the Progressive Era, where, it's this article in the New York Times, Irving Fisher, this economist, and he's, pricing babies at $90 a pop. And I'm like, this is 50 years after slavery ended, and we're still pricing people. And definitely that's one of the arguments I try to make in the book, that, slavery, thank God, ended. And not all the pricing of progress is about slavery. There are other stories here. But definitely, the ghost of slavery in some way lives on.
Yeah, and I'm always skeptical of only blaming the South for this kind of mentality. Yeah, because, we know that the roots of this kind of economization investment mentality is pervasive throughout America. You describe in one interesting passage, I'm sorry, I know I'm quoting from your book a lot, but you have very interesting turns of phrase that I found really help to understand it. You say something about how this mentality created a modern state whose financial foundation lay not in the hands of state legislatures, but in the capital gains that fuse the interest of the federal government with those of its wealthiest inhabitants. And I think that characterizes all of America, really, in terms of it's not about a North-South divide in that very fundamental characterization.
It's so funny you mentioned that because, of course, in that part I'm talking about Hamilton. And Hamilton's goal is he realizes that if America's going to make it, he needs to make sure that rich people have a stake in America. There's a war again, the rich people will come. And what you're saying about the North-South is so true. Actually, my critique of the Hamilton play, and we can get into that, is it completely demonizes the South. It turns
so much else in popular culture.
And exactly. And this is, of course, what liberal Americans...
For good reason, no?
Yeah, no doubt. No, but it's a way of not dealing with your own issues. So liberal Americans can pat themselves on the back and say, and basically, celebrate the father of Wall Street while shaking their fingers at Trump voters.
It's basically slave washing.
Yeah.
So it's very important to me, and I'm glad you mentioned that, yeah, slavery is a part of this, but absolutely, I would even argue, and people have asked me this, well, we do see similar things in England and Germany, and I would say that America is unique in its extreme kind of take on this, and I think slavery does have a role in that, but without a doubt, the pricing of progress is not a uniquely American story.
That was going to be exactly my next question, and of course your book focuses a lot on America, but really, what can you say about other capitalist countries, predominantly Western Europe? What are the fault lines and what are the similarities?
So it depends. So I do think that the United States, so first of all, GDP was invented in America, and I don't think that's a coincidence. So I think, I'm an American historian. I actually haven't taken the global turn as many other people have taken. I still kind of focus on, the nation state, even though the book starts in England. So I do think, I can convincingly make an argument that a book about America can tell this story, even though it doesn't tell the whole story, obviously. But it really depends. So I would say that England always also, like United States, the Anglo-Saxons, very big on it. So like a guy like Sir Robert Giffen or The Economist or all these newspapers, the pricing of progress is definitely also happening in the 19th century in England, no doubt. On the other hand, France, there's a reason Foucault loves moral statistics. Okay, France is
because he's French.
And the French it just never really took off there as much as it did in.
They like moralizing in general.
Exactly. So more, I would say that moral statistics in some ways kind of continued to be the dominant measure. End of the 19th century, they're obsessed about how many children a French woman is having versus a German. Germany, definitely. There's this guy, Ernst Engel, at the end of the 19th century. He's creating basically the formulas to calculate the value of people. So I would definitely place Germany more on the kind of pricing of progress side. And then what I try to show I mentioned this briefly in the book, is that also one of the reasons I think you can focus on America is later this idea, this kind of pricing, that later kind of, when America becomes the global empire, spreads to the rest of the world. So one example that I like to give is that in China today, if you're kind of like a middle manager, regional governor in the Communist Party, the metric that is going to get you to the next kind of step in the hierarchy is often GDP. They are constantly looking at that when they evaluate whether people should get a promotion or not.
I wonder if you can say something about where you think Israel's going in this direction, considering Israel's roots as a much more socialist-oriented country and having made a transition, a very stark and rather sudden transition over the course of the 80s and 90s.
And whether it was a parallel transition to the one that you describe in your book.
Yeah, although later, and I think faster in a way that still shakes Israeli society's self-conception, because as people expect the government to do more to promote equality and living wage and stuff, but then they can't understand why they're living with enormous social gaps. Can you speak to that?
Yes.
I know you're not an expert on Israeli.
No, of course. So for me, I think Netanyahu is really the first one who kind of spoke the language of economic indicators. You know, there are pictures of him kind of like on a whiteboard with a marker, kind of like drawing arrows with GDP figures. So I definitely think in that sense, and when I speak of Netanyahu, I even speak of like Netanyahu finance minister more than maybe even Netanyahu now.
Because that's when he really started implementing these policies.
So I think without a doubt, I still, and you also see the pricing of progress oftentimes in like everyday life in Israel where like, every election day, they're like, how much did this cost the economy? What's the price of democracy? Or, things like that. But I have to say, at the end of the day, when I compare it to the United States, I still feel that it's kind of, so the example I like to give is the poverty report that comes out every year. So there's this poverty report, right, that comes out every year. And correct me if I'm wrong, that day it kind of dominates the news cycle.
Yes,
Wouldn't
it
you
does.
agree?
Yes,
there
it
is
does.
no comparative poverty economic indicator report in America. In America, it's always about what's the Fed's going to do? What's the growth rate in the last quarter? Dow Jones Industrial Average. And Israelis don't care about what the stock market is doing. Also because their money is not in the stock market, it's in real estate, unfortunately. But no, I do think there's a deeper kind of notion in Israel that we're not going to necessarily kind of go for these pricing of progress.
All right, Dr. Eli Cook, a lecturer in American history at the University of Haifa and the author of the newly published The Pricing of Progress, Economic Indicators and the Capitalization of American Life. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And also a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick, or we recommend listening to every single one of them. Check out our archives. We have more than 350 interviews. Like us on Facebook. We are called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel, and follow both Gilad and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.